Hello, welcome back. And this is part two of the Link training series. And today we're going to be going over fueling. Before we get started though, just a quick little reminder, I do offer this course for free, and there are a lot of other companies charging $400-500 for pretty much the same course and everything that I'm covering here. So if you guys could just leave a like and comment on this video, that'd help a lot with the YouTube algorithms and help with my channel a bit. All right, so before we get started with actually jumping into fuel tuning itself, I do have to make a couple assumptions that one, your fuel injector data is entered correctly. If you don't know how to do that, please refer to the first video where I explain the basic setup, that your base fuel pressure is dialed in and that any sort of fuel pressure regulator you have is increasing during boost, and that your fuel filters, fuel pumps, everything is in tip-top shape, because sometimes as VE tables get tuned, you can kind of spot mechanical issues and then you have to go and retune basically everything again. You also have to make sure that your wideband O2 sensor is hooked up, working correctly. Those wideband O2 sensors, especially the Bosch ones, are very sensitive to any sort of drop or vibration. So during shipping or installation, if you drop that sensor on the ground, it could actually damage a sensor. They are that sensitive. So just make sure that all of your fuel system related and emissions related controls are in good working order before we get started. That way you'll have a lot easier time tuning. All right, so the other assumption too, jumping in here, we want to make sure that any sort of fuel correction is turned off. So you're going to want to jump into, on the left-hand side, under fuel. We're going to go under one cold start, your warm-up enrichment table. I would pretty much zero that out before you really get started. And actually, while you're fuel tuning, you're going to want to make sure your engine's up to operating temperature anyways. So as you can see, my warm-up enrichment, as soon as my coolant temp reaches 70 degrees Celsius, there's no more warm-up enrichment. There's also all kinds of post-start enrichments and things like that, but you want to pay attention to your logging. If you do experience weird issues, you can actually log some of these parameters and see if, crank or warm-up or any kind of enrichment is happening on top of your base fueling. A lot of times that could spark issues. So the other thing is this IET fuel correction table. You actually want to zero that out as well. I have mine set based on actual factors in the environment after I've already tuned it, but you would actually want to come in here and just pretty much zero everything out to start with. So you don't have any other variables tuning wise where fuel is being added or subtracted and you're sort of chasing moving target. Now, there are some vehicles where they do have dual fuel tables. This could be either used for flex fuel or VTEC in my case, or any sort of like cam switching control. So Hondas, Toyotas, BMWs, things like that, where you need two separate fuel tables based on all kinds of actions. You can set those based on this activation. It can be based on all kinds of sensors or switch inputs. So it's pretty configurable. And then warm up enrichment, we're going to leave that alone for now, but we also have to make sure when we are logging and driving the car that we don't get into acceleration enrichment. So as you're driving along and correcting fuel tables, you want to make sure you're driving in a pretty uniform and steady state. You don't want to have acceleration enrichment skewing your fueling results. Fuel overrun fuel cut, I would personally have that turned off, even though mine's turned on right now. So you could just set that off. So this is on decel after a certain amount of seconds. So mine's set to 2 seconds. After the TPS is set to 0.4% or lower, it's gonna straight up cut the fuel until it gets to its idling zone, which I'll show you down the road as well. The other thing is some of the newer Link ECUs have long-term fuel trims, and you'll want to make sure those are turned off. So you would come into this table and just make sure that mode is set to off and that your closed loop table is actually set to 0 as well, all zeroed out. The other thing is, going to be your actual closed loop lambda. This is very important. So you want to make sure that depending on the type of tuning you're doing, I'm going to show you 3 different methods to tune the fuel map on a Link ECU, but depending on the method you're using, if closed loop fueling correction is turned on, which means ECU is actually making sure that your car is always hitting your target lambda, and I'll show you the target lambda table here in a second. But all of these settings, especially when this is turned to auto mode, your ECU is going to want to auto correct fueling in any problems up to a certain percentage, so plus or minus 25%, and get you to that correct fueling. So this is actually going to have to be excluded from your data set as you're logging, because with this turned on, let's say your lambda is set to 1 during cruise, and your log comes back saying, oh yeah, the fueling was actually 1 lambda during cruise. I don't need to, calibrate my fuel table. That's not necessarily correct, because you have this correction that's going on behind the scenes with closed loop fueling. So just keep in mind, this is under fuel, closed loop lambda, and closed loop lambda, this little gear. And lambda mode up here, this is where you can actually turn it on and off. So just keep that in mind as we're going through each one of these methods. I'll kind of explain which ones have to have this turned off and which ones you can leave it on with. Now, while we're on this topic, I do want to cover something I actually sort of pioneered myself, and I really like the results of how it turned out. So I want to share that with you guys. If you actually go into the math block, so you have all kinds of these math blocks, which you can have all kinds of equations on any parameters in the ECU that you want and kind of modify them a little bit. And you can actually log against these once they're configured. In the ECU, once you go to one of your empty math blocks, so mine was set to 2, I actually created my own math block that says lambda with no correction. So as you could see, that'd be pretty helpful. If you want to leave closed loop lambda turned on as you're doing your fuel tuning, if your VE table's like way off and could be dangerous for you to drive, if you leave closed loop lambda on, you have to remove the fact that you had that correction factor. So I had created this math block here, and this is actually turning off. So you have a couple different parameters. A is configured as closed loop lambda fuel correction. B is set as closed loop lambda long-term correction. So I just showed you that table before. And actually, you can also probably include the IAT fuel correction if you really wanted to in the equation below. And then your last parameter would be your actual lambda reading. And just make sure you have this set to 3 decimal places, because in the logging and fuel tuning methods, it's looking for 3 decimal places for the correction. So my equation here is in parentheses a plus b plus 100 in parentheses divided by 100 times c. So that would essentially give you the lambda value before the ECU corrected it. So let's say you were driving along and you had your lambda set to 1, your lambda target set to 1, and you were actually coming in at like 0.85 lambda, like super rich. It would actually read in this math block 85 lambda instead of after the correction, the closed loop correction of possibly 1 or close to 1. So you can actually go back into your VE table and correct your fuel map accordingly. So if you're a little bit confused about this section, I would just replay this section of the video because it is a little bit confusing at first. And then after you configure this math block, just make sure you come into logging, and under the log settings that you actually include that math block. So you can choose it right here. Make sure you include that math block in your logging. Won't do any good if you're not logging it. Okay, so as you guys probably know, in certain driving situations, you want to have different fueling targets. So that's where your AFR Lambda target table will come into place. Lambda essentially means that whatever type of fuel you're using, a lambda of 1 is the perfect burn off of that fuel. So if you're using methanol or gas or ethanol or a mix of different fuels, basing your tables off of Lambda would really help because you don't have to do a full retune as you switch fuels. So just kind of setting this up and eyeballing it, I like to, in the cruise area, so we're looking at below 100 kPa in this area and also below like 4,000 RPM. I just set this whole table to 1. And you can actually probably even lean this out even more. Some vehicles in super light cruise situations, so somewhere in here, you could probably set that to like 1.1 or 1.05, somewhere in that ballpark to lean it out even more and get a little bit better fuel economy. I just have for basic sake, I just have mine set to 1. And then as we get a little bit higher in the RPM here, you can see that I get a little bit richer. So the lower value below 1 is richer and above 1 is leaner. As you can see, as I'm going higher in the RPM, because my engine does rev so high and that as you're revving the motor higher, especially on no load circumstances, it does create a lot of friction and heat. So I like to add just a little tickle of extra fuel there, just keep the motor and cylinders a little bit cooler and happier. So then as I get into some of the higher lines, I start tapering that off as I get into boost. I usually don't try to go below like 11.1 to 1 AFRs or below 8 in this scenario in boost. I think it's just a little bit overkill for pump gas. Obviously, ethanol, methanol, things like that, you're going to have completely different numbers here. So don't base it too much on my setup. But and I only make like 10 pounds of boost here, so I'm not going crazy building this table out to like 20 pounds boost. But essentially, you would go from at the 100 kPa to whatever your max boost level is, just start tapering this off in a gradual form. And especially if you're going to be tuning the car on a dyno, you can see and play around with the fueling if it does like certain AFRs better than others for making more power. Some motors like to be a little bit on the richer side, some on leaner to make more power. So it's really up to you, but this is more of a base map in my opinion. All right, so now we're going to be looking at our actual fuel table here, and I can actually pull up a graphic view of it as well. And this is a representation of the efficiency of your engine essentially. And as I was talking before, if you're in traditional fueling, this is going to be the percentage of injector opening from your master fueling number. In the modeled multi-fuel mode, so as you can see right here, this is going to be just a sort of arbitrary number. But usually, especially motors in boost, they usually tend to go over like 100 in the values here. And then when you get towards like wide open throttle on an NA setup, usually like around 80 to 100. Every motor is different though. So you're probably asking yourself right now, how the heck do I know what these numbers are supposed to be? Well, it all comes down to the 3 different tuning methods I'm going to show you. Now, with these 3 tuning methods, there's no right or wrong answer on actually which one to use. Each one of them are for their own situations, and not saying one is faster than the other or better than the other, but I do want to give you those options. All right, so method number 1 is going to be quick tune. Quick tune, in my opinion, is good for situations where you're trying to just quickly dial in the idling, or if you have access to a dyno and you can hold specific load cells, you'll be able to produce a V table fairly quickly and efficiently. So you would actually come up to tuning and quick tune, and of course mine's only available when the ECU is connected. All right, so this is the quick tune interface if you're actually connected to ECU. I'm just at home on my desktop right now. But I will show you live examples here soon as well. So if you go into the quick tune menu, like I was showing you, you'll pop up with this screen. So it'll actually show you measured versus your target lambda. So in this case, it was a little bit on the lean side, as you can see here. So this will help correct your fueling table. Some of the setup items you want to look at here, and specifically that math block I was talking about. So you either have to turn off closed loop lambda before using this, and this is one thing that I was struggling with when I was beginning to tune it. Why can I never hit my target lambdas? And I was always overshooting, undershooting. Well, it was because the ECU was still correcting behind the scenes, and I never had closed loop lambda turned off. So you either want to make sure you turn that off, or if you do want to leave it on, you can set your measured wideband oxygen source to that math block I was talking about. So that'll actually take care of removing the factor of the ECU correcting the fuel table, which is kind of nice. You can set some of the precision values and RPMs you want to lock out at. And here's an important one, the coolant temperature. So under a certain coolant temperature, and the motor isn't warmed up yet, you can set that as a lockout. There's just a lot of fine tuning kind of parameters you can set up here. So again, this is mainly for dialing in your idle. You can actually go to the mode at the top first and then click on auto or manual, I guess, and then have your V table open, and you can start to see it changing the cells. Once you're all done with that, you just hit tune cells or just leave it as auto, and it'll just start correcting your entire V table. Yeah, so if you let this run at idle for a bit, it'll get your idle fueling set perfectly, and it'll idle real nice. Granted, your other idle settings are good. And then if you're on a dyno, you can use the load control feature or the braking to hold the car at specific load cells and make sure the car is driving in the middle of each one of those load cells, because sometimes it could be a little bit off. And especially with these parameters here, it says time in center of the cell, precision, how much from the center you want to be from the center of that V cell that you're tuning. So again, dyno, you can pretty much say, oh, I want to run the car at 2000 RPMs against all these different loads. You'll put, load on the car through the dyno and run up through all these columns one at a time. And that's probably the best way to do it. I'd say if you're trying to do fuel tuning, that dyno, a little bit of dyno time is probably your best option. If you're street tuning, I would highly not recommend this method, and I'll show you other methods that are a little bit better, because if you're on the street, you definitely can't hold these cells for long enough. Tried it. You can try to hold the brake and gas at the same time and load it up, but it just doesn't work. Especially if you have traffic or even on wide open roads. I can't get it to sit in a cell long enough to actually tune it. And especially on the street, you just can't hit every load cell that you need on your V table. Again, good for dynos, good for idle, but that's about it. Okay, so the next two methods I'm going to show you do require you capturing logs. You're going to want to, at minimum, capture engine speed, TPS. You're going to want acceleration enrichment, decel percent, AFR target, your lambda value, that math block I was talking about, and any other percentage fueling additive or cut parameter. So that's going to be pretty much the basics there. So Link does provide a general log tab. It should look something like this. You can actually come in here and hit properties and add or remove values, and you can group them in different like values and pretty much however you want. And there's a cool little navigator at the bottom. So I'm gonna load in a log here. All right, so for simplicity's sake, there is a little bit better way to view this data. So again, I opened my log. So I went to logging, open log from a session that I had before, and I just went to the link standard field tune tab here, and it has your VE table and then your time plot down here of your log. As I'm scrubbing through, you can actually see they have a section that's Lambda and Lambda target. So here, and actually you can add your math block in here. So I wouldn't look at your Lambda value unless it's the corrected version or you have closed loop fueling turned off. But essentially, if you look here, my measured is 0.83 and my target was 0.84, and I was hitting this specific cell. So as you scrub through, you can see my cells change. So if you could find a cell where you're right in the middle of it, that's probably the best candidate to do change on. So this method here is actually called quick trim. So I'm gonna highlight my fuel table here and press M as in Mike on the keyboard. And it's actually going to bring up this quick trim screen. I'm not sure exactly why it's not pulling in my measured lambda correctly. I'd have to look into that, but technically the measured is 0.879 and the target was 0.847. So once I click on that, it's actually going to change the value there. So I would actually go through to the next cell and then repeat the same process. So as you can see here, my AFR target was 0.83 and I was at 0.81. So I need to go a little bit leaner on that. So again, M on the keyboard. And again, this should pull in the values from the log. I'm not sure exactly why this isn't doing it right now, but when you bring up this M key screen, quick trim should pull in those values and you just have to press OK and it'll correct it. But for right now, you would just type in whatever values you're getting in that cell, and again, it'll correct that. So I'd say that method is probably the best for if you're just trying to make very subtle changes, or there's a spot in your map that you know the car drives a little bit weird, or you're having some drivability troubleshooting issues. You can scrub through your log and then correct individual cells one at a time. A lot of tuners like to do this, but in my opinion, it just takes a long time. It's very tedious to do, and if your log never hit those cells, it's not the best. You also have to pay attention to acceleration enrichment and any kind of enrichment that's going on at the same time to make sure you have correct data that cell is being updated with accurate information. So again, I use this for very limited things, just fine tuning once I'm already done tuning everything as a whole, and I just need to make a couple fine adjustments here and there. But yeah, that's one option, is the quick trim menu. Now, my favorite feature of the Link software is using the mixture map. So essentially you would take a log and you would define some parameters and filters on the data that you do get from the ECU, and you can make some pretty accurate and wide range of adjustments at the same time, and it saves a ton of time. And I definitely prefer this over other methods. So I know I'm kind of blocking this right now a little bit, but there's a table down here from default that shows you Lambda versus RPM, and there's a color range of wide open throttle versus crudes. So as you're going through and populating this scatter chart, and your logging is turned on, of course, you want to make sure that you fill out as much of this as possible, and it'll give you kind of a pretty good representation of how much of the VE table you've hit during your either dyno run or street run. And the more data you can actually collect here, the better. It's not like information overload like the previous method where you have to analyze the entire log. Let's say you take a 30-minute, an hour log of driving. You don't have to sift through all that data by hand. this method will actually do it for you. So you would come into the mixture map. If you don't have that already, you can build your own by just creating a new page and adding the mixture map pane. But essentially it says here, unable to draw a map, just right click to update the map. So we're gonna right click and say update mixture map. But first, I actually want to look at the settings here. So this is kind of, I'm gonna show you how I set it up and some of the parameters that I use. You're not gonna have the exact parameters as me. You might have other filters, but this will get you in a good state. Here's your fuel table. Which fuel table do you want to affect? If you have dual fuel tables, you can select each one here. This highlight range just changes the color in which the data is represented. It actually doesn't change anything with how mixture map works. Engine source is always going to be engine speed. Your wideband source, I personally would change this to your math block because that's going to give you a more accurate representation of the data before it was corrected by closed loop fueling. As I've said multiple times, fuel and target load, I would leave these as the defaults. And then you're gonna come down here to filters. You can change this to, let's say it only has to hit that cell in the V table once. You can actually change that to 1. And this is the percent area that the data has to be in that cell in the V table. So you can play around with this, either make it greater or reduce it based on your tolerance. Some of the conditional filters, I like to have filter out any data if I do have dual fuel tables. So I'll say like, fuel table 1 or fuel table 1 status. I think this is fuel table 1 is less than or equal to 0.5. So essentially this was saying that I want to filter any data that's my second fuel table or first fuel table. And then to tune the other table, you would just flip that over. And then that way you can collect data and tune both fuel tables at once, which is very convenient. The other thing I like to do is turn off acceleration enrichment. I don't have that in this log for some reason. If you change acceleration fuel to be less than, let's say, 0.1, you can actually take out your fuel in acceleration enrichment. So if you're accelerating rapidly, it'll just dismiss those cells, is what you want. And then I usually add the decel filter. Again, I don't know why it's not logged in this log here, but all right, so that parameter is going to be overrun fuel cut status. So you want to make sure that's logged in your ECU and then add it here. And again, I would put this to less than 0.5. Usually these status flags are either 0 or 1. If it's set to less than 0.1, you're filtering that out. Okay, I'm actually going to turn these off for now because I'm not sure exactly what this log looks like and I want to get as much data as I can in there. So I just hit OK, and it's actually populating my fuel table right now, or my mixture map. All right, so we've got some data back here to analyze. I wouldn't take this data too much to heart as far as my car is tuned because this is an old log and I'm dealing with a different V table from the version that I've logged. So the data might be a little bit skewed here. So these green cells represent a very, very small error and need very little correction. And then some of these bigger red and orange cells definitely need more attention. I wouldn't pay too much attention to some of your closed throttle decel areas. So that's going to be anything that's like high vacuum, high RPM, things like that, because I didn't have the decel filter turned on. It's going to show data here that I'm running way too lean, which is not the case. So as you can see here, like for example, I have 1,000 samples in this one VE cell. And as you click on it, it actually takes you right to that cell in the VE table, which is nice. My screen's a little bit small, so you can't see it at the moment. But yeah, as you go through, let me go to this. Yeah, so as you can see right here, it's turned blue. And then, so over the course of 10 samples here, the target was 0.96 lambda, and I was hitting 0.98 the majority of the time, and an error of 0.03. So if you want to actually correct this, all you have to do is right click and say correct field table, and then it actually corrects the data right in your V table. I think you can select multiple cells at the same time. Maybe not. Still have to figure out a way to select multiple at the same time. But essentially, like, this one was way off, so it needs some attention. So I would just hit correct field table 1. And again, these orange cells are the ones that have been updated. So after you've done logging and you set your filters correctly, this is a very powerful tool to get your field table dialed in. So again, this is the one I use the majority of the time, and it will get accurate and your best results the fastest, instead of going through every cell and analyzing a log and doing it by hand. So really like this feature. But again, just make sure that you have good data in, because it will skew the results and you'll get all kinds of bad data. So like, let's say you have an exhaust leak or leaky injector or some other issue going on, map sensor isn't calibrated. After you tune your V table and you got like spikes going all over the place and it's not like smooth, then you know you have some sort of mechanical issue, or you're not filtering the data right, or the data itself you're gathering isn't correct either. So again, you want to pay attention to pretty much all the data that's coming in and say, is this truly what I'm experiencing in the vehicle? Especially if you have a wideband or something and you're just keeping an eye on things like, oh yeah, I'm constantly hitting, 0.90 in cruise, or I'm supposed to be hitting 1 lambda with closed loop lambda turned off, then yeah, you could say that the data is correct and the data is actually showing the same issue there. So just go through and you would correct all these cells, and then you have a really nice V table. So again, those are the 3 methods. You have quick tune, you have quick trim, and then you have the mixture map. So those are your 3 methods. And again, you can always come in, just analyze logs by hand and change fuel maps by hand, select whole areas. You can actually multiply by certain values by just hitting star, and you can multiply by certain percent. So let's say I need to add 10% fuel. I would just do something like that. Boom, merchant it up 10%. So you can always play around with stuff like that. But again, you need to make sure that your data is good and that there's no corrections going on behind the scenes, and that you're correcting the raw value that's coming straight out of your O2 sensor, and there's no correction factor applied. So I think that's going to do it for today's episode on fueling. I pretty much covered everything that I wanted to. Again, those 3 different methods are going to be used for different scenarios, so you could always swap between them. But that should get you well in the ballpark of drivability and getting your V table dialed in. And if you guys have any questions, please leave a comment below. And again, a quick 5-second like on the video would help immensely in the YouTube algorithms. And the next video next week is going to cover a little bit of ignition timing and some drivability related things. There's a lot of little settings in these ECUs that I like to tweak that just make that drivability just that much better. So stay tuned for that. I got a lot of tips on that, but again, this math block thing and turning off the corrections, big improvement. Glad I pioneered that. New tuners to link. Hopefully you take some advice from this, and yeah, should be able to get your car dialed in pretty quickly. Fueling is one of the main drivability aspects of tuning. So if you have a customer or you're tuning a car yourself and it just runs or drives like crap, usually it's because the V table is incorrect and you have to do some fueling corrections. So after you're all done with your V table and you get some more logs and you're within 5 to 8% correction as far as the closed loop fueling goes, you can't get V table dialed in 100% all the time within 1% error. Literally impossible. There's too many environment variables and things like that. Your weather, barometric pressure, altitude, all that plays a role. So the closer you can get your V table dialed in, the less work the ECU has to do to correct some of that. And I do like turning on the long-term field trims. So after you do have your V table pretty much dialed in, I like to turn this on, and I'll pretty much max out these values from like 40 to -40. So, and then check on these obviously over time. So if you do have some sort of fuel system issue and it's adding like a whole bunch of fuel in the long-term table, then you know that something's up mechanically with your car, because at one point your V table was dialed in. So the ECU will automatically populate the long-term fuel trim table as you drive, which is really, really neat. And it saves a lot of the hassle of things wearing over time. So let's say like your fuel filter is getting clogged and it needs to compensate for that. This table will help. So even OEM ECUs have this long-term fuel trim feature, just because every car is going to be different, and the tune over time will eventually change based on a lot of different factors. So it's good to have this turned on, and just keeping an eye on this table of any kind of corrections it's doing. Again, if you guys have any questions, let me know, but that's going to be the end of the video. Thanks for watching.